In preparation for the new album, Hackney Diamonds, I listened to every Rolling Stones album. Which album and era are their best? Let's find out. Hey everybody, it's Nick here with you. Welcome back to the Rock Squad channel and welcome to my rock albums ranked for the Rolling Stones. That's right, the new album from the Rolling Stones, Hackney Diamonds, comes out this Friday. It's their 24th British album and their 26th American album. Yeah, if you're thinking the Rolling Stones discography is confusing, join the club. And even though I'm a big Stones fan and I know a lot of their material, I've never actually listened to every Rolling Stones album in order in their entire discography. It's something that I've always wanted to do, and it was quite the undertaking. Listen, I've been listening to so much Rolling Stones, I think I might be turning into Mick Jagger. That's right. I listened to 26 Rolling Stones studio albums. I listened to the non-album singles. I listened to the EP tracks. I listened to the compilation tracks, and I am ready to rank this shit. But instead of ranking every Rolling Stones album, which would take decades to talk about, I decided to rank the eras of the band because they've had so many distinct eras over their 6 decades as a band. I decided to rank their eras and then talk about the albums within them. And like I said, following the Rolling Stones discography is ridiculous. And unlike the Beatles, who also had a plethora of materials on studio albums and non-album singles and EP tracks and compilation tracks, they streamlined their discography into the 13 studio albums and the Past Masters compilation, which made it a lot easier and more accessible to listen to all their material, which is something that the Rolling Stones have never done. I blame the music executives of the 1960s who spent their time butchering classic albums for the US and UK markets, and that's what left us in this mess, so thanks. In at number 1 on my favorite Rolling Stones era, we have the glory years, which includes albums like Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street. This is the best period of the Rolling Stones, hands down. After spending the majority of the 60s playing blues covers and experimenting with their sound, the Rolling Stones really hit their stride here. This is the point of the Rolling Stones' career where their songwriting and their musical ability really meshed together to create the Rolling Stones sound that we know and love today. Look at the hits during this period. You had Jumpin' Jack Flash, Sympathy for the Devil, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Let It Bleed, Brown Sugar, Tumbling Dice, Loving Cup. That is an incredible run of songs just on their own. And of course, my favorite Stone song of all time, Can't You Hear Me Knocking? And these albums saw the Rolling Stones become one of the best rock and roll bands of all time, and it's an incredible run of material for any band. In at number 2 on my favorite Rolling Stones eras, we have the mid-60s, albums like Aftermath, Between the Buttons, and their Satanic Majesty's Request. This is the period where the Rolling Stones were really starting to come into their own as hits writers. They were starting to match the Beatles hit for hit on the charts. Jagger Richards as a songwriting partnership really stepped up during this period. You had songs like Paint It Black, Under My Thumb, Let's Spend the Night Together, Ruby Tuesday, which also featured contributions from the late great Brian Jones. But it also felt like the Rolling Stones were chasing the Beatles a little bit during this period, trying to match their songwriting and innovation, especially on a record like their Satanic Majesty's Request, which just comes off like a Sgt. Pepper ripoff, even though it does have some good tunes. This was an essential period for the Rolling Stones for the development, past being just a 60s blues bar cover band. And at number 3 on the Rolling Stones eras, we have their 70s, 80s rock gods eras with albums like Goat's Head Soup, It's Only Rock and Roll, Black and Blue, Some Girls, Emotional Rescue, and Tattoo You. As great as the Stones' run of albums were in the late 60s into the early 70s, they really started to drop off as the 70s wore on. Don't get me wrong, there's lots of stuff to enjoy on these albums, lots of hits like Angie, It's Only Rock and Roll, Emotional Rescue, Beast of Burden, Miss You, Shattered, pretty much the entire Some Girls album. But there is some lackluster material on these records, and that's totally understandable for a band that's operating in their second decade and still trying to figure out their sound. And since their blend of rock kind of waned a little bit in the 70s, you saw the Rolling Stones really trying to chase every popular genre of the era, including reggae and disco, with varying results. To me, listening back, the Rolling Stones were somewhat directionless during this period. Don't get me wrong, they still had tons of hits on the charts. That really never stopped for the Rolling Stones, but their albums during this period really just don't match the stuff that came out before it. At least they never attempted like prog rock or punk rock. Can you imagine that? Like the Rolling Stones doing their own Pink Floyd?
Yeah.
And at number 4 on my Rolling Stones eras, we have the early years with the Rolling Stones number 2, and Out of Our Heads. All right, I'm going to say this, and it might be controversial. The Stones were a better blues rock and roll combo than the Beatles. You still here? Okay, so that might not be totally controversial for old school Rolling Stones fans who already know this. But for me, who I'm a massive Beatles fan, I love the Stones, but I've never been into them as much as the Beatles. This is somewhat new to me. The Beatles played a lot of rock and roll standards, but the Stones seemed much more authentic playing the blues and rock and roll classics during this period. Plus, the Rolling Stones wrote some really great songs during this period, some early originals that showed the band's promise as songwriters, songs like Time Is On My Side, Satisfaction, and The Last Time. The Rolling Stones may not have had the polish that the Beatles had during this period, but they had something, and you can understand why they would become one of the greatest rock and roll bands of all time. In at number 5, we have what I refer to as the dark years, the Undercover album, the Dirty Work album, and Steel Wheels. Look, it's just a reality that if you were a popular band in the 60s and 70s, the 80s were not going to go well for you. And the Rolling Stones were no exception as they fell victim to the 80s, just like everyone else. Just look at this album cover. Look at Mick's crotch. Ew. Look at all those neon colors. It's blinding. And as much as the Rolling Stones tried their best to remain relevant during most of the 1980s, these albums sound dated like a lot of the classic rock albums of the era. The production is very 80s, the hits are very few and far between, and this just isn't a good era for the Rolling Stones. They did come out of the 80s with a stronger record. I think Steel Wheels is a stronger record than Dirty Work and Undercover, but overall, just not a good period for the Rolling Stones, so it's probably best that we just forget about it altogether. And at number 6 on the Rolling Stones era is we have their 90s resurgence with Voodoo Lounge and Bridges to Babylon. Fortunately for the Rolling Stones, they can forget all about the 1980s and rebound in the 1990s, as did a lot of classic rock artists during that decade. To emerge in the 1990s as not only an active and vibrant band, but also as the elder statesman of rock and roll. And it was during this time that bands like Oasis emerged onto the scene in the mid-90s and made no qualms about the impact bands like the Stones and the Beatles had on them, so it gave the Stones an extra kick throughout the decade. And they may not have had the same impact as they did in previous decades, but they still released some great songs. You had songs like Love Is Strong and Anybody See My Baby, even though it ripped off Katie Lang, both are great tracks. It wasn't the band's glory years, but it didn't have to be. In at number 7 on the Rolling Stones era, and at the bottom, we're going to put the 2000s with albums like A Bigger Bang, Blue and Lonesome, and the compilation Grrr. And after the resurgence of the 1990s, the Stones came to 2000s, significantly reducing their creative output. Yeah, the Rolling Stones still tour the world constantly, but new material during the 2000s was slowing to a trickle. We got A Bigger Bang in 2005, followed by a series of a greatest hits compilation like Grrr, and a cover album called Blue and Lonesome in 2015. And Grrr was the greatest hits package, but it also featured one of the best late era Rolling Stones songs of the time. One of my favorite songs from over the last little while from the Rolling Stones, and that is Doom and Gloom. I love that song. And those are my rankings for the Rolling Stones eras. Now it's time to tell you my favorite Rolling Stones albums. My top 2. In at number 2, we have Let It Bleed from 1969. I absolutely love this record. One of my favorite Stones albums. Obviously, it features Let It Bleed, Can't Always Get What You Want, Gimme Shelter. Come on. Kidding me? Country Hawk, Monkey Man, and more. And then my number 1 favorite Stones album of all time, that would be Sticky Fingers. This is the original vinyl copy that featured the zipper on the cover. And like, does anybody else just feel dirty doing this on the album cover? Because I sure do. I'm just gonna put that up there. And now here we are with the brand new Stones album, their first album of new material in 18 years, Hackney Diamonds, coming out this Friday. Really, really excited to hear the whole record. I love Angry as a first single. I think that's an awesome first single, and I'm excited to see what the band can do in their 6th decade of being a band. It's absolutely insane. All right, guys, that is my rankings of the Rolling Stones eras and albums. Let me know your favorite Rolling Stones eras and albums in the comments below. Make sure to like this video if you liked it. Like it on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe to us here on the Rock Squad channel so you don't miss out on future videos. And make sure to check us out on social media on Instagram and TikTok at Rock Squad Pod. But I'll see you guys for another video here on the Rock Squad channel. Until then, rock on, everybody.